Tapping in.
Are we live?
Let's get it.
You're
like that, man. Critical race theory. We be on the ball, man. We talked about this. We talked about people saying the N-word. You know what I'm saying? We've been
ahead of the curve.
That's right. That's right.
Been ahead of the curve. I don't listen. Just because the audience is still growing, don't get it twisted. The things we talk about always become relevant, and we've been keeping it humble every time. You know what I mean? But it's okay. I'll let the content speak for itself.
Big facts. Big facts. So critical race theory. Where do we start this conversation, man?
Why are we talking about this?
People are in a huff, man. You know, particularly white people are in a huff because it has been presented to them that critical race theory should be taught in schools, and many white people are vehemently opposed to this. Right?
So critical race theory should be taught in schools, and you're saying white people up in arms about it.
Yeah. And it's not. I mean, it's not just white people, right? There are people of color that are opposed to the teaching of critical race theory in their schools as well. And I think that has a lot to do with the many ways it's being defined, the many ways it's being understood, and the kind of intentional, I believe, hysteria that's being kind of sprinkled in, the sauce that's being added in the media coverage of it.
Okay. Because we have a between myself and yourself, we have an audience that covers the whole world, right? We got an audience from all different parts of the world. So I'd like to expand the conversation, especially about something like critical race theory that might seem like it only applies to Black Americans. However, is something that's relevant about how we apply the history, specifically painful and dark history, into today's educational system, right? So in looking into critical race theory, I think always understanding the genesis and the origin of things is always super helpful in being able to understand what it is and how it came about. And so stemming from the 60s, it was Black lawyers in universities realized that there was not any accurate information regarding the slavery period and the history of Black people in the U.S. was not included within academia. And so the theory was brought about in order to dismantle the exclusion of accurate race teachings within the education system as a means of being able to confront it.
Yeah. Right. So there's this scholarly idea, right, that forms in the study of how race is taught in America, that actually race infiltrates every aspect of civilian life in the United States, right? Or racism, right? Whether that's education, whether that's public safety, whether that's access to healthcare, whether that's access to housing, whether that's across the spectrum, right? So that's one of the core fundamental tenets of critical race theory, is that racism is pervasive throughout American institutions, right? There's also this idea that systemic change has only occurred when it's been in the interest of the dominant group, or when the dominant group has been able to see that in their own interest, right? Meaning white people, right? So that systemic change has typically only occurred when enough pressure has been put on white people, or whether that's political, social, or financial, to make it feel like it was in their best interest to make a social change. It also posits that race is a entirely social construct, and that there's no biological basis for believing in differences of race, among a few other tenets. So it's a complex theory, and it's also, when we say critical race theory is being taught in schools, it's a little bit of a misleading statement, right? Because that's a basis of understanding, but we're not in third and fourth grade classrooms teaching the systemic, pervasiveness of racism based on institutions, because the background isn't there. And we can elaborate a little bit more on what is actually being taught in schools, but I'll kind of leave it there as a description of what critical race theory is.
For sure. So when we talk about leaving it in schools, right? Part of why this conversation now is so relevant and why the term critical race theory is increasing in popularity is because there has been a large pulling of information regarding race history and history of race history in the U.S. has been pulled from schools. More books and topics have been banned this year in schools than the past 3 years, right? Just this year alone. So that's the relevance of it, and I'm glad you touched on the fact that there's like a the name of it is misleading a bit, and now they're utilizing this word in order to, let me not say they're using, they is too vague. The word is being used as a means of applying to things that are beyond what the actual concept of it is supposed to be. Now, I'll be fully honest and say that I think the extremism of anything is not very helpful, especially when it comes to education, right? If you're going to teach something in extremes, there's so much that you're going to miss, and a lot of the information really does land somewhere in the middle between these extremes. So even if you're going to take away a lot of books, that's an extreme approach to limiting information. But also at the same time, if you are entirely too open about what stems in, that's an extreme way of education, because now you're forcing people to not necessarily have enough grounding on information because of the overabundance of different type of information, especially at that age, right? So understanding. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, it's complicated, and two, like you said, I like how you framed it in extremes, right? Because two things are happening, right? There's this idea, there's this framework for thinking about race that is like being popularized in scholarly literature, and then there's not enough about the actual factual history of African Americans in the United States being taught, right? And so as people push to increase how much of that actual factual information is taught, critical race theory kind of gets lumped in as this is what they're going to teach now, right? And so to some extent, I'm willing to have a debate about, especially in high school classrooms, what the framing and the lens of that type of instruction should be, and the role of white supremacy in the United States. I think that's a complicated issue, and I think when we talk about how children are educated, like, I'm willing to have a lengthy conversation about that. But I think what we're seeing is that this framework of extremes is making everybody show their hand, right? And certain people that don't really understand or misunderstand what critical race theory is, and really do want the continued reduction of any emphasis on race in schools, right, are showing that that's what they want. And only speaking for myself, my perspective on is at a basis, we can't continue to do the softening of history that we have, right? I remember I came up in the American education system. I remember being taught a bunch of fluffy stuff. I remember being taught that Thanksgiving was a very collaborative unification between Native Americans, First Nations.
It was a potluck. The potluck gone wild.
That was incorrect, right? I was certainly not taught about the extent to which not only slavery was horrible and awful, but also the I was taught I was barely taught the way that it extends and has continued to affect our current society, right? I was certainly not taught about redlining, right? And I was certainly not taught about a bunch of discriminatory practices that have been engaged at the federal level. COINTELPRO, nah. Fred Hampton, nah, was not in my history books, right? So I think there's a pushback against teaching how difficult life has been in America for Black people, because that story inevitably vilifies white people. And that's where my point of contention comes in, right? If you have a coherent argument about the ways in which we teach about white supremacy, I'm willing to have that argument. But if you're pushing back on teaching accurate history of Black people in schools, right? In America, in this country where it does affect our everyday lives, because of you feel like it paints like the truth paints white people a certain way, well then we have a fundamental difference.
I get that. And so there is a bit of adjustment that has to be made, right? There is a bit of adjustment in the sense that more information about indigenous history has to be included in schools. Black, Native Americans, even to a certain extent, you can argue about certain typically Caucasian groups of people, right? The Scottish history in the US has its own flair to it, talking about a people that were escaping an oppression of their own, landed and had to decide and make a choice which side that they were going to step on. Essentially, there's a nuanced history in all people, right? So I feel like critical race theory, that's what it represents, in the sense of introducing a way to include all forms of race education so that kids can be exposed to it early, understand what it is, know why, know some of the reasons that caused it, and also begin to develop their own relationship with it that does not come from misinformation from home. If we're going to teach these kids to think for themselves, at least let's start exposing them to some of the mistakes that we have seen in the past and allow them to understand why those mistakes were bad inherently and how it was wrong to separate people based on their skin color, and understand how systemic oppression actually works in the forms of law creation, in the forms of where people are situated with proximity to cities. All of those things are actually happening right now and are a big part of the reason why there's a lot more people who are coming up without than people who are.
But so now you're getting to the crux of the issue, right? Now you're getting to critical race theory means one thing, but it has come, as you said, to represent this general idea of emphasizing the struggle of and the history of abhorrent behavior that Black people have had to endure, right? And there are some people that vehemently disagree with you. There are some people that say by emphasizing race and emphasizing that painful history, we're doing a disservice to children by forcing them to think about race, by forcing them to think about all of these issues more so than they would if we just raised them and we were just like, hey man, it's all good, doesn't really matter.
I got one question. If that's so bad for kids, what about the people who are actually going through it?
You see what I'm saying? That's you're right? That's what about the Black kids, right? That don't have a choice, that are going to be forced to confront the fact that they're Black inside or outside the classroom, no matter what, right?
Yeah.
And so, but that's part of it, right? Is that, hey man, if you teach that white people were responsible for the enslavement of all these Black people and continue to subjugate them for years after that, and that we as the descendants of white people still reap the benefits of that and have a responsibility to that, how is that going to make my white kid feel?
How is the question? How is the question? And that's the answer we're trying to get to.
Make them feel sad about themselves. It's gonna make them feel like, you know, where it's gonna, you know, that's the argument, right? That's part of the argument. Let me not say that that's the entire argument against critical race theory, but that's a big part of it, right? So, and that's part of it that I just vehemently disagree with.
Well, at least people can understand that when we bring these topics up, you heard it here first. This is probably going to be something that we're going to have to revisit because it is picking up steam, and it has been a hot topic in the mouths of senators and governors, especially in the South, who are running on the basis of pulling critical race theory being taught from schools, which so it's clearly going to be a point of it's going to be a touch point going forward. Elections are going to be coming up in 2024. That's around the corner. We know who's lurking in the windows. So
yeah, it's wild out here.
Stay educated.
And that's the thing, man. We will definitely have to revisit this because as they pull critical race theory, right, air quotes, they're pulling teaching about a lot more than that, right? They're pulling fundamental aspects of history. So yeah, ongoing discussion is needed. We need to continue to clarify these terms and not talk past each other when we have these conversations. That is an invitation for a Republican guest. And with that, we
I think we could do it. I definitely would be so open to having a Republican guest or whatever the case is, man. Because what we do here is curate conversation. We want to listen to people. We want to hear what they want to say. So this is always open conversation. If you want to jump into the comments, jump into the comments.